March 23rd, 1964, Jacksonville, Florida. The city was roaring with anger and frustration. Many of the city's African American residents were taking to the streets to protest against segregation laws that were plaguing African Americans for years. After a bombing of a family home of a 5-year-old boy who was the first black student in his elementary school, and the actions of the mayor who promised to keep enforcing segregation, residents had enough. But for one lady, her focus wasn't on protest. It was just about getting home to her kids. After a long day of housekeeping, she headed home to prepare dinner for her husband and children. She would eventually set out to make a grocery run, but unfortunately, that grocery run would turn deadly. A family would subsequently be torn apart, and the family's quest for justice would turn into a decades-long journey of anguish and disappointment. On this episode of Criminal Intent Off the Record, we'll be looking into the murder of Johnnie Mae Chappell. Hello, and welcome to Criminal Intent. I'm your host, Deandra Cannoli, and for this episode, I'm using the off-the-record format, which is where I add some of my own personal commentary to the story. Usually I try to keep my voice out of it, but there are some places where I realized I had to or felt the urge to say something, often because of missing pieces of information. In a way, this case feels a bit personal. Johnnie Mae Chappell was not unlike my grandmother at the time. Johnnie Mae was young and had a large family, as did my grandmother. So, when I first heard about this case years ago, I couldn't help but to imagine my grandmother and her children going through such horrible circumstances. Perhaps some of you will feel the same way. Something about this case just hit differently, and I knew I wanted to cover it despite not having as much information as I normally would like to have. With that, let's begin with going over the events that led up to what happened in downtown Jacksonville on the rainy night that Johnnie Mae Chappell lost her life. The discussion about the evening that led up to Johnnie Mae Chappell's demise really goes back 2 years, to 1962. Federal Judge Brian Simpson ruled that Duval County School Board needed to approve a plan ending public school segregation, in accordance with the ruling of the 1955 Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board of Education. The first integrated schools were set to start in the new year of September 1963, with the integration of the first and second graders. For those outside the U.S., this is the first and second year of primary school. Each year, a different grade level would be integrated until eventually all the grades would be integrated. But this method would make for slow progress. Since Jacksonville and other towns and cities within Duval County were segregated, this meant that very few black families lived in areas where the all-white schools were. Only 13 black students were enrolled in 5 white schools in September 1963, and this was met with hostility from white parents. One of the students that was enrolled into an all-white school was Donald Godfrey. His mother, Iona, was an African-American civil rights worker. He was one of the first black students to attend Lackawanna Elementary School. The white parents were highly upset, and many protested this act of integration and threatened Iona. On February 16, 1964, a bomb was placed under the Godfrey house and was detonated during the night. Fortunately, the bomb was placed on the side of the house without bedrooms, and no one was physically harmed in the bombing. The bombing attack added fuel to the fire, Acts of civil disobedience to protest the segregation laws occurred. The next day, after the bombing, several black ministers attempted to register for rooms at the Robert Mayer Hotel, an all-white establishment, and were arrested. More sit-ins and hit-and-runs, a type of sit-in protest where protesters would leave before law enforcement arrived to avoid arrest, were happening throughout the city. The mayor of Jacksonville, Hayden Burns, decided to take action in opposition to the protests. On March 21st, 1964, Mayor Burns made a statement to the press saying that Jacksonville will remain segregated and that he opposed any kind of integration. The next day, the mayor deputized 500 firefighters to assist in handling the hit-and-run style protesting. The city erupted into protests and violent confrontations between black and white citizens. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI's, notice to close file, at least 10 fire bombings and 140 people, all black citizens, were arrested that night. On March 23, 1964, a false newspaper report would spark the flames of another protest and the event that would lead up to the murder of an innocent woman. The newspaper reported a story in which 4 black men assaulted a white man. This story was found to be not true at all, and 2,000 protesters took to the streets of downtown Jacksonville in Hemming Plaza. The police pushed the crowd out of downtown, and the marchers headed to the black neighborhood of Durkeeville, just opposite of downtown. During this time, New Stanton High School received a bomb threat, and the students were released. The students joined in with the marchers, and it is said that 4 students taunted a white man. The white man threw a milk carton at them. At this point, I'm not sure if the particular event prompted actions of the students after this, or if the spirit of protest triggered their actions alone, but throughout the town, the students attacked white and conservative black business establishments. That March evening, 4 young white men driving around the city with the express purpose to, quote, get an N-word, would find their victim. What I like to do with episodes of Criminal Intent is to take time to talk about the victims in order to remind the world that these were people who were taken away all too soon, and that their families were forever affected by their loss. A lot of the times we put emphasis on the crime itself and the perpetrators, but I tend to like to do a deep dive into the people who were affected. Unfortunately, in the case of Johnnie Mae, there isn't much information about her. I tried looking through the U.S. Census records to get at least a basic story of her life before the night of March 23rd, but unfortunately, I didn't have enough information to come up with good search results. With that, I can say, according to her headstone, Johnnie Mae Chappell was born in 1928. Her and her husband, Willie Chappell, resided in the northwestern section of Jacksonville, and she was a mother of 10 children, with her youngest being 4 months old at the time. She worked as a housekeeper for white families, and her husband, Willie, worked 2 jobs to support the family. In the documentary Wanted Justice, her children shared that they remembered her being a loving and caring mother. Her half-brother, Ollie Hutchinson, remembers her fondly and described her as his buddy who kept a smile on his face and worked hard. I wish I had more to share about her, but unfortunately that's all I could find thus far. And so now we'll go into the details of what happened to Johnnie Mae on a wet March evening 60 years ago. On the rainy night of March 23rd, 1964, Willie Chappell was getting ready to go to work at a nearby gas station. Johnnie Mae had finished her long day of work and took the bus home. Once home, she prepared dinner for her family. According to the documentary Wanted Justice, she had stopped by the grocery store on her way home. Other sources, including the FBI's notice to close file, implied that she was already home and decided that she wanted to get some ice cream for her kids, or make it even from scratch. I'll be using the FBI's report to talk about a lot of these details. Johnnie Mae walked to Banner Food Market, a local grocery store, to pick up ingredients. Just as she returned home, she realized that her billfold, which contained all of her money, was nowhere to be found. Some sources say that as she entered her front yard, the paper bag she had containing groceries broke. After she picked up the groceries, she realized that her billfold was gone. This was quoted in an article in Folio Weekly, a Jacksonville local publication from 2001. Most sources do not include these details. The main takeaway is that at some point upon returning home, she noticed that her billfold was missing. Since it had all of her money, she felt the need to look for it. With the help of her neighbors, Albert Smith and Tildia Sanders, the three retraced Johnnie Mae's steps from the store with a flashlight in hand. Looking around at grassy patches along the way, the three neighbors walked near the intersection of New Kings Road and Flicker Avenue. Johnnie Mae bent down to see if what she was looking at was her billfold when Albert and Tildia heard a loud pop and noticed a dark Plymouth Fury speeding by. Johnnie Mae clutched her right side and said to Albert and Tildia, "I've been shot." She fell down and one of the neighbors ran to get help. The deputies who were on the beat quickly arrived at the scene, and the ambulance arrived shortly after that. The sheriff deputies questioned the two neighbors about what they witnessed. Her husband, Willie, was also summoned, and he rushed to the scene, which was a short distance from their house. Willie later recounted in an interview his son Shelton recorded back in 1995, a little before his death, the last thing that Johnnie Mae said to him in the ambulance was about their children. She told Patrol Deputy William Plaster, who was the first deputy to arrive on the scene, that she knew she was dying. So her mind was on her children. Willie assured her that she shouldn't worry about the babies because he would take care of them. Willie said that the promise was what kept him together during that time. Johnnie Mae Chappell would pass away soon after that moment while on the way to Duval Medical Center due to blood loss from the gunshot wound to the abdomen. The only piece of evidence that they had was the one flattened bullet that was discovered during the autopsy. No other evidence would be found at the scene. The jurisdiction of the investigation fell on the Duval County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Patrolman William Plaster and his partner filed the report, but for 4 months, little progress was made on the case. That would all change when two sheriff's detectives, Lee Cody and Donald Coleman, happened to pull into a Freezette Drive-In, a fast food restaurant, on the north side of Jacksonville. In August 1964, the two detectives were discussing an unrelated case that they were working on when a young man who the cops knew quite well for all the wrong reasons named Wayne Chessman approached them. Wayne was known as a troublemaker and a bully in those parts. Wayne Chessman told the two detectives that he was going to get his act together and that he would be willing to help them if they needed it. His encounter was unprompted, but he seemed very nervous. Days later, Wayne approached them again at the Freezette to offer his help once more. And yet again, he seemed nervous about something. Wayne's odd behavior tipped off the detectives, and they brought him in for questioning. He would confess to being at the scene when Johnnie Mae was killed. Authorities would soon find J.W. Rich and Elmer Cato to interrogate. James A. Davis was in North Carolina at the time serving in the Army. He was extradited to Jacksonville to be interrogated later. In the early hours of August 11th, 1964, Detective Coleman began interrogating J.W. Rich. Detective Cody recalled that J.W. seemed to be very eager to confess what happened the night of March 23rd. J.W. said that he, Wayne, and James had been drinking beer. Elmer, who was 19 years old at the time and was the driver, was the only one of the four who did not drink. According to J.W., the men had been listening to radio reports about the protests occurring in downtown Jacksonville. Someone said, "Let's go get an N-word," and Elmer drove towards the neighborhood of Picketville in the northwest section of the city. The gun was in the front seat, and he was, quote, cutting the fool, end quote, when he saw three black people walking along New Kings Road. Mind you, J.W. did not say the term black people here. This was edited for the media. Johnnie Mae Chappell and the two neighbors were about 30 feet away from the car, and J.W. stuck the gun out the window. He said that it was soon afterwards that the gun accidentally went off, striking Johnnie Mae. J.W. said that he did not mean to shoot anyone. Elmer Cato and Wayne Chessman gave similar statements to detectives. However, they both said that J.W. Rich was the one that said the infamous phrase, "Let's get an N-word." According to Detective Cody, when he was interrogating Wayne Chessman, he slid the Bible across the table after underlining Exodus 20:13, "Thou shalt not kill." Wayne sobbed and said that he didn't shoot and that he was just in the car. Like J.W. Rich, he said that they were riding around drinking beer and no one was supposed to die. They did talk about the mayor of Jacksonville saying, quote, "them N-words wasn't going to be going to cafes and how they were ruining everything," end quote. As for how they were positioned in the car, according to their confessions, Elmer Cato was driving, J.W. Rich was sitting in the passenger seat, while James Davis and Wayne Chessman were sitting in the back seats. In later investigations of the case, their stories would change in multiple ways, but at this point, their confessions were a big break in the case and were mainly consistent with each other. Detectives Cody and Coleman decided to look for Wayne Chessman's gun. They would find that the gun had changed owners several times within the 4 months prior to the confession. Wayne told the detectives that he sold the gun to Bob Perry, the owner of the Frisette. Bob then sold the gun to a sheriff's dispatcher, who then subsequently sold the gun to a man who ran the sandwich shop inside the sheriff's office. Now, there was new life to the investigation, but Detectives Cody and Coleman were not assigned to work this case. The detectives on the case would need to be notified of the case's progression. The typical protocol would be for the detectives to find the case file, contact the working detectives on the case, and update them with their new findings. From that point, any further investigation and questioning would be taken over by the detectives assigned to the case. However, there was a problem. Detectives Cody and Coleman couldn't find the case file. They were aware of the murder and knew that an investigation should have been underway, so a case file should have been easily accessible. What happened to it? Since detectives Cody and Coleman worked the night shift, they had access to the chief homicide investigator's, J.C. Patrick's, office. In an episode of Wanted Justice, the two detectives recounted how they looked around the sheriff's office and could not find anything until, that is, Detective Coleman happened to look down on the floor and noticed something that looked like a piece of paper sticking out from under the plastic carpet cover of the chief's desk. He lifted it up and he saw a stack of about 30 case files. The one on top the Road Patrol's report on Johnnie Mae Chappell that was not filed. Detective Coleman stated that it had to have been put there by Chief Patrick. Detective Cody and Detective Coleman informed Sheriff Dale Carson about what they had found in the chief's office. While one would think Sheriff Carson would have taken this misconduct of Chief J.C. Patrick seriously, no repercussions were ever considered. Instead, the next day on August 13th, 1964, the two detectives were called into Sheriff Carson's office along with J.C. Patrick. The chief had some harsh words to say to the two detectives, and then said that they were off the case. "Don't try to rock the boat, boys," Chief Patrick said, "because this anchor is too big." Soon, Detectives Cody and Coleman would find that their partnership was dissolved, and that they were assigned to other duties as a demotion. Within a year, they would be fired for insubordination. He believed that this was done because of the discovery of an alleged cover-up of the Chappell case as well as others. But unfortunately, this act of misconduct was never investigated. While Sheriff Carson promised to investigate, according to the FBI notice to close file request, there was no evidence that the case was ever reassigned, and it appeared that no further action was taken by the Duval County Sheriff's Office. Elmer Cato's vehicle was not impounded for evidence, and no forensic testing was done on Wayne Chessman's gun. The gun would soon disappear from the evidence unit, and it was never recovered. With the confessions, the gun, and the bullet that was retrieved from Johnnie Mae's body, on September 25, 1964, Wayne Chessman, Elmer Cato, James Alex Davis, and J.W. Rich were indicted by a grand jury on charges of first-degree murder. I have to say, this is remarkable that the indictment even occurred. Considering how things were at the time, it's kind of like a miracle, but let's not get our hopes up here. Things were looking promising, but that quickly started to change. Originally, the men pled guilty to the charge of first-degree murder, but the next week, they changed their pleas to not guilty. Then, the gun somehow went missing from the evidence locker at the sheriff's department. On December 1st, the trial of J.W. Rich began. Not having enough money to afford an attorney, he was given a state-appointed public defender. The jury consisted of 12 men, all of whom were white. All three of the other alleged accomplices were subpoenaed to appear in court to testify against J.W., but only two showed up. Neither one was called up to the witness stand to testify. According to the FBI, one of the accomplices said that he remembered them all being offered immunity in return for their cooperation, but there were no existing court records for an immunity agreement that could be found. Keep that in the back of your mind. We'll talk about that later. As for any other testimonies, the responding officer, William Plaster, was never called to the stand. However, Detective Coleman was called up to testify despite being removed from the case. He was only asked about the confession he obtained from J.W. Rich. The case would hinge on the only physical evidence that was presented in trial: the flattened bullet that the local coroner's office had retrieved from Johnnie Mae. Remember, the gun was never tested, and the question of how the bullet was flattened was never investigated. The gun could not be entered as evidence for the trial since it was missing. No associated testimony with an explanation on how the bullet ended up in its flattened state was included with the admission of the bullet as evidence. Because of this, the defense's strategy was to go with the angle that Johnnie Mae's death was a complete accident. According to a juror who was interviewed by the FBI in 2005, the defense argued that the condition of the bullet was evidence that J.W. Rich had fired at something else. The bullet had to have ricocheted from that surface into Johnnie Mae's abdomen. To add to this, J.W.'s confession stated that he had not intended on hitting Johnnie Mae. He had pointed the gun out towards the three people on the side of the road, but the gun, quote, went off, end quote, by accident. To me and others who researched this case, it seemed that the defense painted things as if these young men were simply going out for a joyride and did something foolish. That foolishness led to J.W. Rich pointing out a loaded .22 rifle in the vicinity of three innocent bystanders, and the gun accidentally went off. And when the gun was identified, it hit some unidentified surface. Mind you, nothing at the scene was found that would show that this would have happened. And this bullet allegedly struck Johnnie Mae in the abdomen after hitting that unidentified surface. I think it's safe to say that it's hard for many people who have heard or researched this case to believe that the four young men who used racial slurs to refer to Black people throughout their confessions and just so happened to be riding around with a rifle during the night of the protest as simply going for a joyride, pointing this rifle at three innocent bystanders and it just accidentally going off. It's very hard to believe that this is what really happened. Why point the gun at anyone, loaded or unloaded? Why was the gun loaded? Despite the holes in the defense's argument, the jury agreed with the quote-unquote ricochet theory. And on December 2nd, another day of the trial commenced, and the jury would make their decision as to the fate of J.W. Rich. After an hour and 4 minutes of deliberation, the jury came back with a verdict. J.W. was guilty, but not of first-degree or even second-degree murder, but of the lesser charge of manslaughter. On January 4th, 1965, he was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in prison, but was paroled after 3 years. The prosecutor dropped all charges on the other three men, citing insufficient evidence. For the family of Johnnie Mae Chappell, this was hardly justice, as her death ripped a hole right through her husband and children's lives, causing a close-knit family to be torn apart. Willie Chappell tried to make good on his promise he gave to his dying wife. For a couple of years, he worked hard to make ends meet and kept the children with him, but the state of Florida intervened. They deemed Willie as incapable of providing adequate care for the children and divided them up into foster homes and juvenile shelters. As Shelton Chappell, Johnnie Mae's youngest son, said of the situation, "We lost our mother, we lost our father, and we lost each other." Shelton would become one of the biggest voices to emerge in the quest for justice for his mother. Being only 4 months old at the time of her death, his brother, Willie Chappell, named after their father, said that he was always asking about his mother. What was she like, who she was, and things like that. Willie said that he would answer him not knowing exactly how Shelton would turn out to be with this information. But the information seemed to fuel a fire within him to try to somehow have his mother's case be reopened again and brought to trial. J.W. Rich could not be prosecuted again for the crime, as he was found guilty and served time for the murder of Johnnie Mae, even though most would probably consider his sentence to be very light. Charging him with the same crime would have been double jeopardy, which is deemed unconstitutional. But the other three men that had their charges dropped could possibly be brought back to trial in Johnnie Mae Chappell's murder, if there was enough sufficient evidence that could be used against them in trial. There were 8 attempts to reopen the case under state and federal jurisdictions. The case was most recently opened in 2008 under the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Act of 2007. The reopening was to look into the possibility of a state or federal prosecution occurring. The state of Florida would conduct its own investigation as well in 2012. All the investigations after 1964 would lead to essentially the same conclusion. Significant factual problems, loss of evidence such as the court records for J.W. Rich's trial, the weapon used in the murder, and the death of witnesses, as well as being unable to locate some witnesses, and additionally, Florida's legal limitations due to their speedy trial rules prevented further prosecution. Another barrier would appear in April 2012. The state attorney's office for Florida's 4th Judicial Circuit granted immunity to Wayne Chessman, Elmer Cato, and James Alex Davis in exchange for sworn testimony regarding Johnnie Mae's murder. The office did not consult the Department of Justice prior to granting immunity. Before this point, the earlier claim of immunity could have been refuted because there was no documentation on file that stated immunity was granted to the three men back in 1964. However, now the state had officially granted it, and it was documented. In short, the federal government lacked the jurisdiction to prosecute anyone for the murder of Johnnie Mae Chappell, and the state of Florida similarly lacked the evidence needed to go further. Now, we also had the addition that they granted immunity to the three men who were in the car with J.W. Rich at the time. The granted immunity makes it incredibly difficult for the remaining three suspects to be brought to court for their alleged role in Johnnie Mae's death. And that is currently where this case stands. It was officially closed in 2015 by the FBI with their notice to close file that was signed. So now the federal government is not looking into it anymore. And there's no word if Florida is going to look into this again. I highly doubt that much could be done because they granted immunity. So it makes it much more difficult to try to bring anyone to court for this murder. I have to say, it is quite difficult for me to come up with a conclusion. It's hard to accept that this is where things stand. Out of all of this, one person served just 3 years, and yet a whole family was split up, and 10 children had to live their lives without their mother. A husband had his wife and children ripped away from him. It all seems so cruel. A large part of the injustice was because of racism. And we have to be real here. Because of the lack of care the sheriff's department had with this case, crucial evidence went missing and precious time passed before a thorough investigation could occur. And even then, there was no thorough investigation. And thank goodness for Detectives Cody and Coleman for stepping up and going against the grain to actually look into the case, despite it not even being their own case. And despite the fact that they risked their careers and actually ultimately suffered with their careers because of the fact that they went against the grain. They bucked the system. It's crazy to say that they bucked the system by doing their actual job, but that's what happened. And ultimately, they got demoted and lost their jobs because of it. Even after the detectives found the perpetrators, the case didn't receive the investigation it needed, thus leading to where things are now. I think the thing that keeps this case on my mind is the fact that the Chappell children would have only one photo of their mother, and that is of her lying dead in the morgue with their father looking over her in grief. There is a photo of an older black woman floating around the internet that is said to be of Johnnie Mae Chappell, but it's not her. Johnnie Mae was just 35 years old when she died, and the woman in the photograph looks significantly older. I just find it heartbreaking to know that Shelton and his siblings don't have an image of their mother while she was alive. And they never had a chance to make more memories with her. And Shelton never got a chance to really get to know her. It's just so tragic. Perhaps, against all odds, some kind of closure can come from this. However, with more time passing by, the remaining men being in their twilight years of life, the possibility of further justice being received becomes more and more elusive. There are so many more cases that have occurred during the years of the civil rights movement that don't even have this much of a conclusion. But I'm an optimist. I think that there's always hope that things can change. Maybe some breakthrough can happen, and perhaps justice long deferred can be served. Thank you for listening to Criminal Intent. If you like what you heard, please feel free to follow on your favorite podcast streaming app. You can also find more episodes and other goodies at criminalintentpod.com, our official website. If you would like to support the production of this podcast, please check the show notes. There'll be links there. And you can also see the link to our sources that we use in the podcast. If you would like to check for updates, you can follow us at our Instagram at Criminal Intent Pod or on the app formerly known as Twitter at Crim Intent Pod. That is CRIM Intent Pod. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.